Thank you, Ray, and it's a pleasure to be with all of you this morning in Hawaii and this afternoon in Chicago, where I'm tuning in from. You'll see over my shoulder here, I have a picture of one of my favorite places on the planet Earth. That is the Ka'e Beach on the north side of Kauai. It's too bad we cannot all be together in Hawaii today, enjoying your lovely state, but we'll make do with our Zoom call. I wanted to add to Ray's introduction, in addition to my professional background, I've been personally affected by Alzheimer's and related dementias, starting with my grandfather who died of dementia, probably the vascular type dementia in 1987. Even though I had been a social worker for about 15 years by the time of his death, and I was involved in the field of aging and healthcare during his time of dementia, but unfortunately we had very little guidance, the kind of wonderful guidance today shared by Dr. Kale in dealing with some of his behavioral challenges and of course the stresses of caregiving. But fortunately, later on in 1987, I was invited to join the staff of both the Alzheimer's Association in the Chicagoland area, as well as the Rush Alzheimer's Disease Center, which later became a federally funded Alzheimer's Center. And that's where I did a lot of my clinical work, both there at the chapter and at Rush. And that led to a great deal of knowledge gained from the family members that I dealt with over the years, the men and women who were my true teachers, because there was nothing in my education and training, and even, as I said, my professional experience until then, that prepared me for some of the challenges undergone by family members. In addition to my maternal grandfather, my mother died of dementia about 2.5 years ago. She had some comorbid conditions, including heart disease and lung disease, but ultimately, I think it was the dementia that caused her death. Certainly, it hastened her decline. And she stayed at home until the very end of her life with very little in-home support, except from those family members who were nearby. She refused all professional help. So I well understand the many challenges of those of you who are family members who are dealing with this, as well as professionals who wear perhaps the hats of both professional and family members. And finally, I'm currently caring for a friend living with dementia. He probably has a Lewy body type dementia. He's a gay man in his 70s, never married, no children. And many years ago, he and I worked together and we developed a very close bond. And he asked if I would serve as his power of attorney if he should ever become disabled due to dementia or anything else that might cause him to become incompetent. And so I agreed, knowing full well that my wife would stand shoulder to shoulder with me to take on that kind of responsibility. And he began showing signs of dementia about 3 or 4 years ago. And just about a year ago, we moved him into a memory care assisted living facility. So I have all that professional experience as well as personal experience. Before I continue, I do want to acknowledge today's sponsors. Shout out to Plaza Assisted Living, not only Ray and Leah, but all the staff there who put this day together. Also the Hawaii Healthcare Association and any other sponsors who were involved in producing this Zoom event. And again, thanks to my dear friend, David Troxel, who is a longtime consultant to Plaza, as well as a wonderful educator and author. So without further ado, like any good continuing education program, I'm going to advance the slide. Let's see, can't quite do that here. Having a little difficulty doing that. There we go. So, oops, let me go back. Got ahead of myself. Sometimes it takes a few seconds for that to kick in. All right, so let's talk about objectives for today. I'm going to describe the changes in expressions of intimacy and sexuality over the course of dementia. As many of you know, this can last anywhere from a couple of years to as long as 15 or even 20 years in rare cases. I'm going to talk about how we can help family care partners, especially spouses, to cope with the changes in intimacy and sexuality over time. And lastly, talk about when someone moves into a care facility, what are some of those challenges, not only for family members, but staff members as well. Okay. So just a quick definition of terms. Intimacy I see as talk, kissing, hugging, holding hands, and cuddling without overt sex. And sex acts are aimed at pleasure, such as touching of the genitalia, anus, the groin, breast, inner thigh, or buttocks. But sexuality is really the expression of sexual sensation and related intimacy between human beings. So I thought that's helpful to have those definitions in hand today, because I believe that many people confuse intimacy and sexuality. And I believe most people with dementia really do crave intimacy, perhaps even more so in the course of dementia, because of the many impairments they suffer cognitively as well as behaviorally over time. Now, of course, most people with dementia are older adults in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. We believe that roughly a third of the people over age 85 have some type of dementia. We also know that there's younger onset dementias, referring to people who show symptoms before age 65. Roughly between 5 and 6 million people, as has been pointed out by LJ earlier. And because most of the people living with dementia today are older, a lot of younger people in particular think that older people are asexual, meaning they shouldn't be talking about this, let alone doing it. And so that's one of those stereotypes that we're up against when we start talking about this topic. And then you throw into the mix dementia, because many people consider people with dementia to be completely incompetent. And they may lack capacity to make certain decisions for themselves, but throughout the course of dementia, they can make maybe simple decisions, certainly less complex decisions over time. And so when you put old people together with dementia, the idea is they should be completely asexual. And unfortunately, because of these stereotypes and stigma surrounding both aging people and dementia, there's been very little research or interest in researching these particular topics. And I hope that changes in the coming years, because unfortunately, we're at a stage in the state of science today, and I know more of this will be discussed later on, but we have very few good treatment options on the horizon, let alone the existing treatments that we have on hand. And so I'm afraid we are in for the long haul, and we're going to really need to develop a great deal of training and education tools to help navigate through a lot of tricky problems such as intimacy and sexuality in the course of dementia. And to make it even more challenging, we have few written policies to really give guidance to staff who are dealing with these situations in both the home care setting as well as in residential care settings. Let me just say that there are many factors that may affect sexual activity among older adults. And probably the number one reason why older people are not sexually active is due to the lack of an available partner. And that may be caused, number one, by death, or perhaps that partner has some kind of illness that makes it difficult for them to either perform sexually, or perhaps they lose interest in sexual activity. And yet they may continue to express a desire for sexuality, and certainly may express a desire for intimacy, despite any kind of comorbid conditions. In addition to illnesses such as dementia, there may be conditions such as diabetes and heart disease, lung diseases that may cause someone to become incompetent, unable to perform sexually, as well as the medications to treat them may cause someone to become sexually impotent. We do know that the older we get, the less sexual activity is reported by older adults. So I looked at the research published in 2017 by Lindahl and Associates. In the subgroup age 65 to 74, 53% of the older adults reported being sexually active at least on one occasion in the past year. In the age group 75 to 85 years of age, it was 26%. So in essence, less than half of the previous age group. Now, this study did not go beyond age 85 in reporting the incidence of sexual activity. However, we can probably guess that the incidence of sexual activity is even less among the very oldest old in our population today. Also, I might point out that the living situation may be a factor in sexual activity. So what happens in the privacy of one's home stays in one's home, right? It's between two consenting adults. And I'll get into issues of consent later on, of course. But when someone moves into a care facility, less than ideal for privacy. And it turns into a semi-private or even a public situation, which I'll be getting into a lot more detail, why that may hamper sexual activity. Just to refresh your memory about some of the classic symptoms of dementia, progressive memory loss, increasing problems with language, both the spoken word as well as the ability to comprehend the language of other people, problems making decisions, judgment issues, disorientation to time and place, also maybe having difficulty even recognizing one's spouse or an adult child, problems performing activities of daily living or ADLs, mood and behavior changes, such as Dr. Kale was talking about earlier. And lastly, but not least, sexual dysfunction is often an overlooked symptom of dementia. And fortunately, when I was working in a diagnostic clinic, I worked with a fine group of neurologists who were bold enough, I dare say, to inquire about this aspect of a person's life. But generally speaking, this seldom comes up due to the ageist stereotypes that many physicians and other diagnosticians have fallen into. And so I would recommend that if this is a problem, to bring it to the attention of providers and clinicians. And if you are indeed a clinician, to inquire about this. So the progression of dementia over time, I've divided it very neatly into 4 stages. The distinction between these stages is not always clear. But that squiggly line at the upper left-hand side of the slide represents one's level of independence, gradually declining over time. Again, the rate of decline is going to vary from person to person. Much of that decline will depend upon medications, upon comorbidities. Most people will die of other problems before they reach the late stages of their dementia, but absent those terminal conditions, they may well progress like my grandfather did to the late and end stages of their dementia. And over time, people definitely will lose their ability to recognize their loved ones, which may really cause great disruptions in the marital relationship as well as in the relationship with other loved ones, particularly adult children. Let me just focus on spouses for a moment. Dementia brings about many changes in the marital relationship. The so-called well spouse, who's not always well because many of those spouses are older and have health problems of their own, but many of the spouses will have to fill the gap created by a loved one's dementia. And that means assuming responsibility for a wide variety of household tasks like driving and paying bills, gradually assuming responsibility, particularly in the middle stages, for personal care, so that offering reminders to a loved one with dementia to take a bath or a shower, to get dressed and undressed. These are very tedious kinds of everyday tasks that may cause some disruption in the relationship. And ultimately, all sense of shared decision making is lost in that relationship. It slowly devolves into a one-way street, which can really make a spouse think more like being a caregiver rather than a partner, and certainly less of a sexual partner and more of a physical caregiver for a loved one. And I think it's obvious that this is going to color one's views as well as one's practices when it comes to intimacy and sexuality. What does it take to have a satisfying sexual relationship? Well, it takes feeling physically comfortable with a partner, emotionally comfortable with a partner. And again, if there is any kind of disruption in the relationship, this key feature of a satisfying sexual relationship may be diminished or lost altogether. There's got to be a level of comfort between partners. There's got to be an attraction. And because of the caregiving role, that kind of sexual attraction may diminish or be lost altogether. It also requires feeling secure and positive about the relationship. And not to say that couples still can't have a positive relationship, but there are many spouses who become distressed by their caregiving role and responsibility, and they may be upset about all these different changes. And it's going to take a great deal of work to overcome some of these obstacles to maintain that positivity in the relationship. Also, to have a satisfying sexual relationship, you have to be able to communicate properly with your partner and about sex in particular. And because of the language problems, the communication issues that are inevitable in the course of dementia, this key element is going to be affected. And so this may really confuse matters even further. And lastly, it requires having a positive self-image. And unfortunately, many people with dementia, particularly those who are aware of their symptoms of dementia, may lose their self-esteem. They may also be subjected to the irritability and upset of a partner who's not understanding what they're going through, someone who is correcting them and pointing out their mistakes. So this goes back to the need for education on the part of the well spouse to make sure that the victim is not being blamed. So we really need to try to keep the couple cohesive as possible. This requires extraordinary emotional work as well as a great deal of education. So let's talk about the impact of dementia on sex. And I'm going to go through each of these four in some detail. But so first of all, we're going to talk about the loss of interest or capacity by the partner with dementia. Someone may lose interest, and someone may lose capacity, but someone may still have interest, but lose capacity. All right, so I'll get into some examples to further describe that. Secondly, because of the changes in the caregiving role, there may be a loss of interest or capacity by the well partner. Thirdly, there may be continued interest or capacity by the partner with dementia, in spite of all their changes in activities of daily living, changes in behavior and thinking, other cognitive issues. This might be one area of their life where they still have retained capacity and interest, which may be upsetting, or it may be okay with the partner who is providing care. And lastly, we'll talk about hypersexuality. This is a very rare symptom that was not touched on by Dr. Kales, but I will address it. And perhaps later during our panel discussion, we'll be able to get into some conversation about that with her, because she is truly the expert. So let's talk a little bit about the research about this issue of loss of interest or capacity. There, as I pointed out, there's been relatively little research on this, but some French researchers did a wonderful survey of so-called well spouses, and These spouses reported, these 70% of them reported there was indifference to sex by their loved ones with dementia. In other words, lack of interest. They showed no desire and no interest in sexual activity. In another study, that this is now nearly 30 years old, half the men with dementia were impotent concurrent with the onset of symptoms according to their wives. And this was a study done among a group of veterans at a VA facility on the West Coast of the United States. Just last year, a study was published showing that sexual impotence among men may even be a risk factor for dementia. Now, the question arises, was it the chicken or the egg? And I tend to think that maybe these are intertwined here, that dementia may be one of those early symptoms of dementia, maybe even before the memory loss occurs because of the physiological damage to the brain, and it may be causing problems with both performance as well as interest. Now, interestingly, some couples may adapt to this problem of loss of interest or capacity. They may desire to focus in on non-sexual forms of intimacy, such as touching, holding, and dancing. Let me just read to you some quotes that I've gathered through the years by couples that I've dealt with. This is a case of a woman whose husband was no longer able to perform sexually, but he did have interest. And she was 81 years old when she told me this. He is so terribly frustrated by impotence. We do a lot of cuddling and loving, which is fine for me, but not for him. He desperately wants to, quote, give me one, which I do not need except to comfort him. So in his mind, according to her, he felt he was only a man if he gave her an orgasm or if he was able to attain and maintain an erection. And that was not important to her. So she was satisfied with this, and yet he was very frustrated. And she did her best to reassure him. And in spite of all the changes in their relationship, when she told me this, he was clearly in the middle stages of his dementia, and she had made many, many adaptations to their marriage. She rarely had driven the car in the marriage. She took on full responsibility for driving. She occasionally worked on some bills and some aspects of their financial affairs, but by this stage, she was fully in charge of driving and the finances. She was taking on most of the responsibilities inside the home, making appointments, reminding him to take his medications. Of course, at first she found that burdensome. She worked through a lot of grief to get to this point of acceptance, and yet she was still able to hold on to this one part of their marriage. And I did my best to try to support her, because some people would have decided, you know, because of all these changes, I can't put up with this. I'm just so put off by his behaviors and his dependency. I can't even hug him anymore. And so I applauded her for her efforts and her ability to continue to reassure him in spite of his deficits. Just an amazing woman. Not everybody is capable of doing that. I understand that. Another woman made this accommodation. She said to me, I discovered that although my husband expressed a desire for sex in spite of his impotence, he really wanted to be hugged and reassured of my love in other ways that did not stress his mind and body. Similar to the other case, she was at first put off by this, but she decided, you know, at least this is one aspect of my marriage I can still hold on to. So why not enjoy this kind of attention? So this was satisfying to her. On the other hand, as I said, some spouses just say, you know what, his loss of interest or her loss of interest, that's fine with me because I've lost my own sense of desire for him or her. And this is just a part of my life that is now in the past, and that's the way it's got to be, and I've got to accept it and move on. Easier said than done. I think this is a part of grief that is often overlooked, and I will talk about grief in a little bit. But I see grieving as a natural part of learning to cope with a loved one's dementia. Let's talk about that second situation in which there's a loss of interest or capacity by the well partner. As I said, providing care becomes a primary role and may become very, very stressful. And one's own mental health and physical health may be at risk due to the multiple stresses of caregiving. And we do know from the literature that primary caregivers are at high risk of depression, anxiety, and physical health problems, even mortality in advance of a loved one with dementia. This is serious business. So the loss of interest is certainly understandable, except to maybe the partner with dementia, who may still wish to be sexually active. In this case, it becomes yet another challenge for the well spouse. So he or she needs to make excuses repeatedly because a loved one with dementia may forget why this person is trying to put them off. This may be a source of frustration, even anger and outright agitation. Again, I hate that word too, but trying to understand their anger and trying to pacify them in other ways. And again, I go to a previous point that maybe what they're looking for most of all is reassurance and physical touch that's not necessarily sexual in nature. Now let's talk about a person with dementia who is indeed perhaps still interested and capable. But again, the well partner may be able to continue sexual activity in spite of these challenges. As I said, holding on to some sense of normalcy in the relationship. And one wife said this, at least this is one thing he can still do well and that we can still enjoy together. And a husband who is in his late 70s happily admitted to me, my wife is now less inhibited than ever before in our marriage. She's very affectionate and likes to initiate sexual activity. I must admit that I don't mind accommodating her. He had a big grin on his face when he told me this. And, you know, dementia is a moving target, meaning the changes occur over time. And ultimately, he did lose interest because of her growing physical care needs. When she became incontinent, that was sort of a marker for him that this was no longer a satisfying experience. But they enjoyed a sexual relationship as long as possible for him. On the other hand, some people, some spouses complain, you know, that, and one gentleman told me, she has become very childlike in every respect, even during sex. I go along with her just to make peace. And again, that was time limited because of her growing changes over time. And I have a video that I'll show you in a little bit that's going to highlight this. I want to go back to this slide for a moment because I did have one example that highlighted this. A husband described this dilemma. He says, my wife simply forgot how to make love. She was interested, but did not know how to proceed. At first, I could coach her along, but this grew bothersome. Eventually, I felt like I was having sex with a young child, and so I quit altogether. So you see these enormous emotional challenges for spouses. Let's move on to this rare symptom called hypersexuality. This refers to uninhibited and compulsive sexual talk or sexual behavior that's directed towards oneself or other people. So when I say directed towards oneself, I'm talking about masturbation to the point of repeated masturbation that may cause self-injury. And this harmful behavior clearly must be dealt with. Also, if it's directed towards other people, it may be directed to just one person or it may be indiscriminate. So it goes beyond one's spouse. It may extend to adult children who are misidentified as one's partner or even complete strangers. And this is just aberrant behavior that is very, very troubling. But instead of taking it personally, I try to recommend that we objectify this, treat it as a serious symptom. We need to assess the causes. As Dr. Kell points out, we just can't throw a sedative to calm this person down, although it may be considered an emergency that requires some quick response. But then you've got to tease out the various possible causes of this. Clearly, we need to take measures to protect that individual as well as others, especially within a long-term care community where this will just upset everybody within the community, which is like a little village. The word spreads very quickly. And of course, then we throw in the factor that many family members may see this kind of behavior being displayed, and it's just very, very disturbing for all concerned. So clearly we have to assess and treat this behavior. Again, too often the problem is treated with antipsychotics such as Haldol or benzodiazepines. And this might be used for emergency purposes, but I've worked with a fine group of geriatric psychiatrists here in the Chicagoland area who, after an initial trial of that, will always try to scale back and then try something else. So for example, I did have a man who was exhibiting this kind of behavior in a long-term care community. He was treated initially with a benzodiazepine, and then after a couple of days, they did tease out it was not due to urinary tract infection. He did not have a new stroke. They did not do an MRI or CT scan to look for any evidence of stroke or some other changes. They did lab work. There were no changes seemingly with regard to his labs. And so the geriatric psychiatrist decided to try him on a low dose of prednisone. And after prednisone failed, they used a female hormone, Depo-Provera, which proved to be the winning combination for this gentleman. It actually had the effect of lowering his testosterone level, and it curbed his behavior. And eventually he was weaned off that, but they weren't going to take any chances. So it took about 6 months before they felt safe to discontinue, and they tapered him off eventually. And it seemed to be like many of these symptoms to be time limited. And it was just an unfortunate phase in this gentleman's life. There was one home-based situation I wanted to share with you, and this is a case of a woman who reported to me that her husband was demanding sex of her on a nearly daily basis. And this poor woman, she was really embarrassed to talk to me about this, but I always made a point of encouraging couples in particular to talk about changes in their marriages, and this led to this particular conversation. And she clearly was distressed as well as embarrassed by his behavior. And again, I was quick to point out that this is a symptom. And so I began to, tick off, some of the boxes that Dr. Kell was talking about earlier. And this didn't seem to be due to any kind of urinary tract infection, although that was ultimately ruled out. It seems that this gentleman did have capacity and interest, despite his wife's lack of interest. She was just going along to get along. She did mention this problem to her daughter, which was a very embarrassing conversation for her. And her daughter learned at a support group, "Mom, you just got to put up with some things." Well, as a general rule, that's not bad advice, but in this particular case, it was devastating to this older woman. And she was clearly worn out. And I was afraid that this was leading to a very serious depression on her part. So I asked her about this, what this gentleman did during the day. And he was simply following her around the house. He was really becoming like a shadow to her. And some of you who may have been family caregivers may have witnessed some of this behavior yourself. And so he was simply an observer and a spectator in her life, and this was a bit bothersome, but she grew accustomed to it. But this triggered sexual feelings, and so she would stop what she was doing. They'd go to the bedroom and have sex, and she would just feel terrible afterwards. So this had been going on for about a month when we had this conversation. And so I said, well, how is he outside the home? And she said, he's a perfect gentleman. And this is what drives me crazy. He can act so much better with other people than he does at home. So I've made a habit of trying to get outside the house as much as possible. And I said, so what happens then? Well, you know what? It seems to calm him down. The activity seems to wear him out. So he tends to forget about sex and forgets about me as a sexual partner. And I said, well, is there any opportunity, any further opportunities for doing that? She says, well, I got to get things done at home, but I've been toying with the idea of having him go to an adult day center. There's one in my neighborhood, but I've been reluctant to go because I once mentioned the idea and he didn't want to leave the house without me. And again, this is something that many people with dementia refuse to do because after all, they become so accustomed to a loved one who keeps them safe and happy. Well, ultimately, the gentleman was coaxed to go to the adult day center, and he started off going twice a week. After the first week, he wanted to go every single day, meaning 7 days a week. And unfortunately, the center was not open, but 5 days a week. And the wife reported almost instantaneous positive results that he got so worn out by the day center, where he was a complete gentleman to everybody, including the ladies, that by the time he got home, he was tired out. And this seemed to solve the problem of his hypersexuality. So it didn't involve any kind of drugs. It was just one of these things that he was understimulated except for sex, which was his sole activity in the home. And so it was replaced by something far more pleasant, far more positive for both husband and wife in this case. So it goes to show you, that when Dr. Kale was talking about assessment and treatment, we've got to consider all the different factors and be very creative. And for those of you who don't have the benefit of a counselor or social worker or a nurse or a physician, please reach out, contact the local Alzheimer's Association. Find somebody who can help you sort through some of these difficulties. You cannot go it alone. If you try, you are going to fail miserably. This is the most solid piece of advice I think I can share with you today. This is not for Lone Rangers who always suffer negative consequences, to reach out for help as soon as possible. So on that point, I think we need to have these kinds of sensitive conversations. In another study of veterans' wives, nearly 8 in 10 reported that changes in sexual frequency occurred. So 92% of these wives reported a decrease in sexual activity, and 8% reported an increase since the onset of dementia. So in most cases, indifference or impotence was the driving factor in the decrease, but in a small minority, an increase in sexual activity, according to the wives in this study. But here's what I want to mention most of all. None of these spouses, and there were over 400 spouses who were involved in this survey, none of them had been asked by healthcare professionals about the impact of dementia on their sexual relationship. Now, I'm not surprised by that because, again, because of the ageism that does exist in our society, but also I think because of the lack of sex education in our society and the lack of comfort in talking about sex in general, about anybody in healthcare. Now, let me just highlight one personal example. When I was age 40, I developed severe back problems and turned into a one-year fiasco. I had severe problems that resulted in a staph infection. I was given a steroid injection that caused a staph infection, which caused my disc to degenerate. It was like having a broken back. I was hospitalized on 3 different occasions for about 30 days. And in the course of the next year, I encountered probably at least 2 dozen, maybe 3 dozen healthcare professionals. At the time, I was married, 3 relatively young children. Obviously, I was working full-time in the prime of my life. And would you believe not a single healthcare professional asked me at all about the impact of my disabling condition on my sexual relationship. Once in a while, and once in a great while, someone would say, what's this doing to your psychological life? But no one even inquired about my marriage, let alone my sexual relationship. We have become so symptom focused that we've lost sight of what it's like to treat people holistically. And to me, this is just a crying shame, because if we're not dealing with people on this holistic level and just focusing on a symptom and one modality of treatment, we're really not doing justice to that individual. It's not person-centered. So I have come up with a few simple questions to get the conversation going. And I would encourage you to ask these simple questions, regardless if you're a professional or if you work with family caregivers in an informal role, if you're a support group leader, just to throw out this rather benign question. How has your relationship changed since the beginning of your partner's symptoms of dementia? I would always start with this question. And I would say probably 8 out of 10 times, it would lead to a conversation about the sexual aspect of the relationship. I was surprised at first because I was not accustomed to asking people about their sexual relationship. But this is how I learned about the impact of dementia on sexuality and intimacy. This is when older adults became my mentors and teachers. And it was an eye-opening experience to hear their struggles and their need for conversation, their need for direction. And I realized in my capacity as a social worker in a one-to-one setting, I was in a great position to be a listener and a learner. And just by asking this question, it was a source of a great relief to them to be able to unburden themselves of some of the challenges they were experiencing. At first, I hardly had any knowledge base. I went to the literature and all I read about was, the rare problem of public masturbation and the rare problem of hypersexuality. Hardly anybody 30 years ago was even talking about intimacy and sexuality as I'm talking about it today. A second question to ask, and this is more pointed. Most people coping with a level with dementia have concerns about their sexual relationship. Do you have any concerns you would like to discuss? And this essentially is giving them permission to talk about some very deeply personal issues. And I would say over the last 30 plus years of asking these questions, I've only had maybe 3 people who've said to me, young man, and of course for many older adults, I'm still a young man, even though I'm in my 60s. Only a handful of people have ever said to me, you know what, that's a personal question. I don't care to discuss it with you. And that's the way it's going to be. And in all those cases, I naturally said, of course, I fully understand. I just wanted to give you an opportunity to discuss in case it was something you wanted to discuss. So in the vast, overwhelming number of cases, people actually enjoy the opportunity to talk about something deeply personal that was not being discussed with anybody else, friends, family members, and healthcare professionals or social service professionals. Also, and I generalize here based on the research, most partners report a decrease in sexual activity, whereas some people report an increase. Is this an issue for you? Sort of put it in a positive light, right? That maybe they're not alone with this kind of experience, and to say, if there is an increase, to normalize it. If it's a decrease, normalize it as well. Again, this will open the floodgates in most cases. You've got to provide an opportunity and reassurance that they're having a confidential conversation. And again, it's not a one and done kind of thing. Because of the nature of dementia, it's going to change over time. what is going on today may be a different story 6 months or 12 months from now, and it may be different years from now. So to keep having these recurring conversations to check in, to give them some kind of continuity so that their story over time is understood by someone who is concerned and has an active interest in their well-being. This will break through the isolation they're experiencing and reduce problems associated with depression and anxiety. So there's one very simple model that I have followed that describes some of the interventions associated with some of this very rich information that is shared by spouses or partners. I don't want to limit it to married people. So it's called the PLISSIT. The P stands for giving people permission. And I would say the vast majority of my work has been in giving people permission to talk about the feelings they have experienced in their caregiving journey, whether it's their anger or their rage directed towards this disease or their loved one. Sometimes it's anger expressed towards themselves for failing to understand what's going on. It's anger at God or other people who perhaps they felt they should be able to count on for help who are absent from the caregiving situation. This can include family members and close friends who maybe have opted out for whatever reason. Just giving them permission to talk about the feelings of loss and the changes they've been experiencing. Also, giving them permission to either participate in sexual or intimate behaviors, or giving them permission to refrain from those behaviors as well. The LI stands for limited information. And this goes to the basic need for education about dementia, as well as basic education about sexuality and aging. Because nobody goes to school about this except relatively few people involved in gerontology and medicine. But people who are caring for loved ones with dementia know virtually nothing about dementia. As Dr. Kale pointed out, most people just get a diagnosis, maybe a prescription, and they are sent on their way. Maybe follow up months later, but very little education. Again, reading books, pamphlets, going to reliable websites like ALZ.org, the Alzheimer's Association, National Institute on Aging, to really get solid information about not only dementia, but aging and sexuality. This can go a long way towards helping them address some of their grief. As you can see, the SS in this model refers to specific suggestions. So in this context, I'm talking about maybe making suggestions about non-sexual expressions of physical intimacy, such as hugging and dancing. As we know, music and dementia go hand in hand. Putting on the music does something to really stimulate people with dementia, and adding dancing to the mix can really enable a couple to enjoy each other's company in profound ways. Maybe making suggestions like separate bedrooms, if indeed the partner, the well partner, is not interested in sexual activity any longer, to recommend, if possible, separate bedrooms or separate bedtimes that might provide the opportunity for some separation if that is desirable. Also, employing good old distraction and redirection strategies so that spouses are not just arguing or trying to use logic with someone, but really giving a loved one opportunities to engage in meaningful work, such as in the case example shared earlier of a woman who needed an opportunity to enjoy some food and participate in cooking. The IT stands for intensive therapy, and I think in this context, it refers to some short-term counseling or the kind of medication I was talking about earlier, such as the hormonal treatment or in some cases, we have had some success. There have been cases of women who exhibit hypersexuality. Certainly the men outnumber the women in this regard, but we've had some success treating women who exhibited this symptom with either antidepressant or an anti-anxiety medication. So again, this is really the domain of geriatric psychiatry, and I would recommend that you seek them out. They're hard to come by, but again, using local resources to track them down and use their expertise, and to really work on treating someone intensively with the right kind of medication after one has done a proper assessment. So let's talk about grief for a moment. Grief is a very serious problem. I think we need to, again, I can't recommend highly enough the need for disease education, counseling, recommending people respite services such as day centers and memory cafes, and getting people to support groups. And I highly recommend this book by Dr. Pauline Voss, Loving Someone Who Has Dementia. It's subtitled How to Find Hope While Coping with Stress and Grief. So this is, if you have time to read it, or if you can find somebody to help you get through this rather meaty book, it has enormous benefits to help spouses cope with their grief. I would also recommend one of these very helpful memoirs written by spouses who address this particular issue that I've been talking about today. I also want to point out that we live in a sexually diverse society where finally we have accorded rights to lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender men and women who have traditionally suffered a great deal of prejudice and discrimination throughout their lives. That is slowly changing, but unfortunately many of them suffer discrimination, particularly in long-term care communities where people might not be understanding of what's going on. So we've got to be very careful to uphold the rights of people living with dementia who have perhaps don't conform to traditional sexual orientations, because this is a very serious problem. And unfortunately, many people who are LGBT are being forced back into the closet. So let's focus in on what happens when someone moves from home into a long-term care community. It's the most significant move of a person's life, not only for that individual, but for the entire family. Independent living situations, assisted living facilities, there are locks on doors, but in memory care communities, the locks are seldom, if ever, used. In nursing homes, there are no locks at all, not only to ensure safety, but unfortunately, that affords little or no privacy. So the picture I show here shows two people living in a memory care community. Now, you might look at them and say, now, isn't that really a cute picture of two people getting along quite well and holding hands together? However, would you feel differently if that was your spouse holding hands with somebody else? Or would you feel comfortable if this was one of your parents and your parent who was still living in the community was aware of this situation? So this gets into some of the complexity I want to address in the final portion of my talk today. And I'm going to kick it off with this particular video, in which I interviewed a gentleman who I first interviewed for a film I did called 1,000 Tomorrows. And we tracked him and his wife over time. She was 59 years old at the onset of her dementia, and then she lived another 8 years. But after 6 years, about 5.5 years, she was moved to a nursing home for a wide variety of reasons. And I want to show you a clip of this gentleman's talking about the changes in their lives. Oops, hold on. Cue this up again. Here we go.
it was necessary to put Betty in a nursing home. It was a devastating day in my life as well as the life of our children when that happened. We checked out several nursing homes prior to deciding on one, and we took her to a nursing home in Bloomingdale. She had a grand mal seizure in the summer, and within a matter of 3-4 months, had a total personality change. Her physical demeanor, everything changed about her. She was totally lost. She couldn't use the telephone. She didn't know her address. She didn't know how to get to the phone. She didn't know where the door was. Her health then began to deteriorate. She lost 35 pounds in 3 months.
You had once talked about the fact that you were really living on borrowed time with Betty, and you were making the most of every day with her. And then as she began to change, as the disease took its toll, you were really affected, as I recall, feeling a sense of distance from her. She was still somewhat amorous towards you, but you no longer appreciated that because of her physical care needs.
Yeah, I think a problem that developed between us was the fact that knowing that she wasn't in her quote-unquote right mind, I felt like I was taking advantage of her if I wanted to show my affection. There were times when I felt like she knew who I was. Then there were times when I was a man, that I wasn't her husband, and that she didn't want a man around her. She wanted to be left alone. So that was a very difficult time for us. And even though I knew she loved me, she just wasn't the Betty that I had known for so many years. So that really did become a difficult thing for us. Occasionally, even in the nursing home, I would feel like she knew who I was and she wanted to hug me and I would hug her back. But there certainly is no appropriate place to show your affection in a nursing home. And she was at a point where I couldn't take her home. And so that the love-making part of our life was just a thing of the past.
Mm-hmm. In other words, there was no privacy at all in the nursing home. It's pretty much of a public place.
It's a public place, and even when she had her single room, there are no locks on the doors, and so there are residents in the nursing home who are happy wanderers, and they would come in at any time and often. And so it was just a regular family circus, even visiting at the nursing home. And but there were those times, I remember once or twice when I would just, and it's a single bed, she's in a regular hospital bed, but I would just lay down beside her and snuggle up next to her and just hold her. And that was gratifying for me, just to be able to hold her and to let her know that I was there for her.
Mm-hmm.
So that was just a real heartbreaking case for all of us. And Everett, it was just a wonderful care partner to his wife throughout the course of her disease. She died about a year after we did this filming. And he was a very popular guy among the ladies during her time in the nursing home. He often told me he felt like a widow more than a spouse, but he had many opportunities to go out on dates. He always resisted the opportunities. He wasn't looking for romance at that point. He was still not in a position to do that. I understand why people might engage in relationships with the opposite sex during that period of time, but he opted not to. And about 2 years after Betty died, he did remarry, and last time I checked a couple years ago, he was still happily married. So it was a happy ending to a very long, difficult process, not only for him, but for their 4 adult children. So let's move on to talking about relationships in long-term care communities. Residents are mostly interested in companionship with other residents, visitors, or staff. Sexual activity is rare. It rarely occurs between residents or with their past partners. And it also raises the issue of consent, as Everett pointed out in his interview. Let's face it, residents spend most of their time with staff members who are primarily young women. And, this is the resident's home. This is where they live 24/7, probably for the rest of their lives. And so staff are loving, they're caring, they're helpful, they're friendly, and they provide personal care, sometimes intimate personal care. And so naturally, sometimes residents may confuse this kind of special friendship with romantic interest, particularly the older men who might take a liking to some of these younger women. And so it becomes a real challenge for staff to try to either explain or dissuade a gentleman from touching them. And so it's going to require, some understanding on the part of staff to figure out why this is happening, and to learn from other staff who might be working with these individuals. This is why it's so important to share what's going on with a particular person. Sometimes sexual contact may be isolated to just one particular staff member. And if that staff member cannot respond appropriately, maybe it's time for a reassignment if at all possible. But I have found that maybe just listening to that person and trying to offer some kind of non-sexual intimate talk or touch may be satisfying to them. And I've had many female staff, married or not, who point out a ring that they wear on their finger to point out that, I'm already spoken for, and I hope you can respect my relationship. And sometimes that's enough to dissuade a gentleman from any kind of sexual overtures. Unfortunately, that kind of information may be forgotten, and thus the need to reinforce that kind of idea. Also, I might point out that staff have got to be careful about not perhaps evoking a sexual feeling by being careful about the way they dress, the way they present themselves physically. Many younger people today wear clothing that is considered very revealing and outright sexual in the minds of older people. So we have to just sort of check into that point of view as well. Masturbation may be occurring in a public place. It should be considered a private place, so moving someone who might be disoriented, making sure that they are afforded the dignity of a private place, and making sure that someone is not being considered a dirty old lady or a dirty old man because they have lost sight of where they're at and they want to engage in this sexual act on an occasional basis. Again, if it becomes a habitual kind of thing, it may evolve into hypersexuality. But we should not be blaming people for doing this kind of behavior that might have been commonplace at home. I want to talk about the rights of residents. They have a right to be treated in a dignified way. They have a right to make friends. They have a right to have conversations and choose people that they're attracted to. They also have a right to be free from exploitation. That means sexual exploitation that I want to talk about. So these are federally protected rights, and usually states have their own set of rights that reinforce these federal rights. I thought I just would mention that because too often we use the rights of individuals to say, well, you can't go into somebody else's room, or you can't be engaged in a certain kind of behavior. And I would say we need to be open-minded about this and really think about what are they looking for. Sometimes residents will strike up relationships with others who are not their spouses because they have forgotten their spouses. Men in particular are in the minority here in long-term care communities. Females roughly outnumber men 3 to 1, so the men may be getting a lot of attention. It's interesting to see my friend who is gay in a memory care community that is, he's far outnumbered by women, and he usually has 2 or 3 women who are with him, seeking his attention. He's not sexually attracted to him, but he's always been very, very kind and polite to women. He loves attention, and even when they touch him, he's not put off. He enjoys the intimate physical contact with them. And again, sexual activity is going to be rare, but I'll talk about when it does occur. Another quick example of a gentleman with his wife. His wife had him go into a long-term care community, but there he met a female. And this is from an HBO documentary called the Alzheimer's Project.
Baseball. Baseball. Good job. Good job. If you have a piece of chalk outside on the sidewalk.
What's up?
Wait for me.
Huh?
Wait for me.
Wait for you?
Yeah.
I don't know where I'm going.
You don't have to know where you're going around here.
I wonder where else I should go. Where else do you think I should go? Thank you.
Okay, there you go, Clara. Isn't it a nice day outside?
Isn't it a burglary land here with all of the shoulders?
You want to go in?
I'll do it. I want to do whatever you want to do.
This isn't a very nice place. Let's go some together.
He's my husband. He's wonderful.
We're lucky. Yes, we are. I wonder where I should go. Hi, how are you? We can go in here. Is there anybody in here? I don't think so. Let's see. No. You want to sit down there? That's nice. I'm glad you're here.
You can lie down, sweetheart.
Do you want to lie down?
Yeah, I want to lie down.
Why don't you go over there?
So clearly these are two people who met each other in this memory care community. And some people might be alarmed by this, but in this case, the wife was fine with this relationship. I'm not going to show you the next, in the interest of time, the next clip, in which the wife and daughter come into the front door and they see Woody and his girlfriend together on the couch. They're snuggling together, holding hands, and the wife and daughter are completely accepting. They were kept in the loop about this relationship by the staff, who said they seemed to hit it off almost immediately upon Woody's entry into the community. For the wife, this was devastating at first to see how easily she could be replaced. But fortunately, one of the staff members took her aside after she was showing signs of tearfulness. They had a private conversation, and the staff member pointed out that perhaps there was something about this woman, Kathy, that reminded Woody of his wife. And the wife said, you know what, I don't know if that was true, but I believed it. I had to believe it. And I decided, all right, this is just part of this experience of giving up control, of letting go. And it's just the next phase in a very strange journey of our marriage. And so thereafter, she decided that when she and her daughter, her only child, would visit, they would accept this relationship, and they would visit him alone, and sometimes they would visit them together. And she took comfort in the fact that Woody had a companion virtually any time, day or night. She was convinced that they never really had a sexual relationship. It was no longer a concern for her. They had stopped having sexual relationship early on in his dementia. She was convinced he was impotent. And so it was not even a concern for her any longer what they were doing together in his room, snuggle up together in bed. Rather, very touching. It does raise the issue of consent and capacity. And the American Bar Association and the American Psychological Association have come up with 3 simple standards to try to tackle this all-important question. And so the first standard is the ability to understand information about alternatives, risks, and benefits associated with a task, decision, or choice, including the choice to have a sexual partner, even in dementia. The ability to use that information to make a rational, self-directing choice, and the ability to consistently communicate one's choice. And I would argue that for people in the late stage of dementia, this becomes very, very difficult to express this particular kind of choice, but not altogether lost. Every situation is going to require an assessment. There is no specific test for assessing sexual consent. It's important, if there's any question, to employ mental health professionals to interview the resident, the power of attorney, and key staff member who know about the relationship that may be taking place, and also to look at any kind of guidelines and policies that have been established within a care community, although they tend to be quite rare. Visiting spouses and partners. I think it's so important, as in the case of Woody, to help them enjoy their visits, to involve them in social activities, with care activities, if that's what they would like to do. I think it's really important to know the wedding anniversaries and their birthdays to help celebrate that, because clearly the partner with dementia will have forgotten those things. And it falls upon the staff, I think, to make that recognition. I think residents can be visited in private unless there's some reason to restrict or supervise visits by a spouse or a partner. There have been rare cases of exploitation or abuse. And unfortunately, because of my experience in this regard, I've known of a few instances which have been very, very troubling for staff and family members alike. And I just want to point out that there was one particular case involving a gentleman who made the very difficult choice to have his wife with dementia go into an Iowa nursing home. This was a second marriage for both of them, a late life marriage. They both got married in their early 60s a second time. And the woman had 3 adult children by her prior marriage. Henry Rayon was an Iowa state legislator at the time this story unfolded. Even after she went into the nursing home, he continued to have sexual relations with her, according to staff members who observed some sounds and saw some activity that made them concerned about his wife's ability to consent to this activity. And so at a care plan meeting with the medical director, they felt that he was overstepping his boundaries, that she lacked capacity to consent, and he allegedly continued this activity. And this activity was reported immediately to his wife's adult children. The adult daughter in particular was petitioning the court for guardianship because she was privy to this behavior. And shortly after this, within a matter of weeks after this report, the wife suddenly died. And within days after her funeral, Henry Rayon was arrested for felony sexual abuse. This happened in 2014. The problem didn't go away. They didn't settle out of court. He had a trial in front of a judge. He ultimately was found not guilty of sexual abuse. So there was a question about did they have proper evidence to really accuse him of this. But I think the intent was to embarrass him, to bring shame upon him, and his career as a legislator was over. But he said through the press over time, he felt that right through the end of her life, that this was an opportunity for them to recognize each other. He never felt like he was exploiting her. And so this shows the very difficult changes associated with somebody who perhaps may lack capacity for consent. And this is what keeps administrators up at night, worried that they might be subject to lawsuits as well as some kind of a criminal prosecution in the case of someone who might lack capacity. So I think when it comes to just intimacy, without sexual contact, I would argue it takes a low level of consent. But if there is consensual sex, at least if it's alleged to be consensual, as in the case of Henry Rand's, I think we really need to make a case that this is indeed consensual and use some of those capacity standards with documentation and full assessment by a mental health professional. And clearly, if it's non-consensual, if the person is unable to give consent or behaviorally is unable to give consent or is quite defensive about sexual activity, we have to err on the side of safety and say this is non-consensual. And this would be considered exploitative and abusive in nature. So I think in all this conversation, we need to try to understand what is the point of view of somebody living with dementia. Sometimes staff overreact when they see two unrelated residents who are touching each other or becoming close friends. We shouldn't jump to conclusions that this is wrong or inappropriate behavior. On the other hand, I think we need to educate family members or powers of attorney about what is going on. After all, staff are clearly in a position to observe 24/7, 3 shifts, to make sure that people are being safe. So we need to have conversations that this is behavior that is either appropriate and everybody's on board, or if spouses are opposing someone who is having a kind of intimate relationship but not a sexual relationship with a fellow resident, to try to deal with that spouse's grief, because it's very, very difficult, if not downright impossible, to separate people. I know in one particular case, a spouse was so upset that even though staff tried to separate two seemingly consenting residents who were not sexual, but this behavior was just driving the spouse out of her mind with anger. She moved her husband with dementia into another care community. Now, I heard through a third party at the other facility that the husband did indeed engage in this behavior in the second facility. So clearly a move to another place was not the solution. I think the more appropriate and yet challenging problem was to deal with the wife's grief, to help her engage in some kind of counseling so she would come to terms with this kind of behavior on her husband's part, because he clearly didn't recognize her as his spouse any longer. And it was essentially her problem and not his. So we need to, again, if a resident is capable of consent, try to explain this to a family who is not on board, but to support those who are on board, they might need some coaxing and persuading and education to come to that point of acceptance. If someone is not capable of consent, again, not to make rash judgments, to sit down and have a conversation, to try to explain to someone why this behavior may be inappropriate, to set limits, to document and assess the incapacity, and to reinforce that in a care conference. And this may be enough to stop that behavior. On the other hand, it was not enough to dissuade Henry Rand in his case. He felt like he was being victimized by the staff. I'm not here to judge him or the staff, but clearly it was not sufficient and it had disastrous consequences for all concerned. So in summary, expressions of intimacy and sexuality can be rewarding, but it poses many risks and challenges for all concerned, whether people are still living in the community with spouses and other caregivers like adult children, or if they are living in a long-term care community. I think we need to really, again, open up the conversation, not to be afraid of this, to treat people holistically. We need to support residents who can consent to these behaviors and protect those who simply cannot consent. And again, to help those spouses and partners who are grieving over the changes in their loved ones with dementia. This is an ongoing process. This is not something that people get over in a day, in a week, a month, or even a year. It's a process that unfolds over time, and we need to be constantly vigilant to their ever-changing needs. There have been a number of long-term care communities that have developed policies and guidelines. You can Google the Hebrew Home at Riverdale, New York. Over time, they have been updating these policies and procedures that have been very effective for the residents of this long-term care community that includes independent living, assisted living, memory care, and nursing home. Over 600 residents in this very large community outside of New York City. Just a few years ago, the American Medical Directors Association, which these are physicians that oversee long-term care communities, they came up with a white paper to give guidance to staff working in these communities. Also, a Canadian group, the Atlantic leads the Greenville Long-Term Care Working Group, have developed a guideline. These are all readily available online. And lastly, in Australia, Alzheimer's Association of Australia, known as Alzheimer's Australia, they have a document developed in 2010 that is still current today called Understanding Dementia Care and Sexuality in Residential Facilities. Just excellent resource for anybody concerned about these issues. And lastly, I will mention a couple of resources that I was involved in producing, some DVDs and online resources entitled Sexuality, Intimacy, and Dementia in Residential Care Settings. This is aimed towards staff in long-term care communities. So it's a 6-part training program. Film I showed you of Everett, it's entitled More Than 1,000 Tomorrows. It was a sequel to the one entitled 1,000 Tomorrows. Both of those resources are available through a nonprofit film production company here in Chicago called Terra Nova. terranova.org is the website. You can see those on demand or purchase them. Another one available through Terra Nova called Freedom of Sexual Expression that was produced by the Hebrew Home at Riverdale, New York. Excellent resource. And lastly, one produced by a group at Johns Hopkins University called Physical Intimacy, the Person with Alzheimer's. And finally, a couple of written resources. Again, that's a repeat, the one from Australia, but also a wonderful one by an academic researcher named Gail Dahl at the University of Kansas, entitled Sexuality and Long-Term Care. And she devotes probably a good 25% of the book to the challenges of sexuality, intimacy in long-term care communities.